I'm going to read chapter 11, Sell Swords. If you recall me saying, Podkin didn't know much about money and what it was worth. He was a chieftain's son, and everything he'd ever wanted had been without having to pay for it. A spoiled brat, some might say. But now that he had a sour taste of real life, those 5 copper coins clutched in his paw seemed like all the treasure in the world. He tucked them inside his cloak and swiftly pulled Pook away from the dingy corner, back into the market throng. The last thing he wanted was those scruffy rabbits trying to steal their money back, so he spent a while dodging to and fro, hiding behind stalls, roots and crumbling pinners. Once they were good and lost, he stopped to think. What should he do with his winnings? Give it all to Quince and Shape? The thought made him sink. Maybe he could give them a few coins and keep the rest hidden, but then they might search him. He could buy Pook and himself something to eat and take them the rest. Then he thought of poor Paz, shut up in the cage on her own, cold and scared and lonely. Spending money on themselves would just be selfish. Looking around for inspiration, he saw that they were standing near the sellsword enclosure. The group of mercenaries were identical to the ones on the show the last time they were there, and the agent was still sprawled by the gate, calling out his business with so much enthusiasm as a bored snail. Hired swords, he mumbled. The fiercest fighters in the whole of 5 realms, the greatest warriors in whatever. Some of them fought, somebody else once upon a time, and apparently they were quite good, better than average at least. Business must be slow with that kind of patter, Podkin thought. They'd be glad of any coin. With his 5 coppers, he might be able to hire the lot. Then he could take them back to Mr. Shape's burrow and watch them make matching fur coats out of him and Quince. Before he really knew what he was doing, he had marched up to the agent and prodded him in the belly. Excuse me, Podkin said in his best regal voice. Would you be the rabbit to see about hiring some mercenaries? The agent looked up and down for a moment and then roared with laughter. He didn't stop until tears were running down his face. That's very funny, kid, but go and play your game somewhere else. I'm trying to do my business here. It doesn't look like it, said Podkin with a sniff. I want to hire your men, all of them. He poured the coins from his cloak and held them out to the agent. 5 coins, 5 whole copper coins. That's right, said Podkin. Consider this your lucky day. Ha! The agent was about to laugh again, then began to look irritated instead. 5 poxy coppers. Do you know what that's worth? It will get you half a mouldy carrot and a jug of ditchwater, if you were lucky. It's not enough for a single one of my men. Goddess above, I don't know whether to laugh or clip your ears. Sorry, ear. Not a single one? Podkin's lovely visions of rescuing Paz and watching Shape and Quince get flattened vanished in a puff of smoke. Well, I say that, the agent scratched his head. I'll get you him. He pointed to the corner where the grey-furred, black-eyed rabbit sat on his tattered blanket for an afternoon. Podkin stared. A blind soldier rabbit for an afternoon. It was hardly the help and protection that Bridget promised they'd find. Could it even be enough to free Paz and give them the chance to escape Bone Roop? Probably not, but what other choice did he have? I'll take him, he said, handing over the money. Krom, the grey rabbit said. My name is Krom. And have you been a soldier long? They were standing just out the sellsword enclosure with Podkin craning his neck to look up the new employee. Pook was trying to climb up one of his legs, the grey rabbit. Krom just stared straight ahead with those blank white eyes. Yes, very long. His spear was crisscrossed with old scars and his armour was dented and scratched. He looked like he'd seen a good deal of fighting, for sure, although Podkin wasn't sure how he could fight when he couldn't even see. But what about your eyes? I fought for a long time before this happened, said Krom, and I can fight now, just differently. Podkin nodded, still not convinced. The grey rabbit didn't seem bothered. He cleared his throat. May I ask you a question? Yes, said Podkin. Why is it you want to hire sellsword anyway? I can tell you're only a child. You shouldn't even be in a low-down place like this. Some rabbits have my sister, Podkin said. They've got her shut in a cage so that I'd come out here and steal stuff for them. I need you to set her free so that we can get out of this place. Shape and Quince, Krom said. Yes, do you know them? I've heard of them, said the grey rabbit. He shrugged. I hear a lot of things. Do you think you can beat them? Podkin asked. I mean, Mr. Shape is pretty big. I can take care of myself, said Krom, patting his sword in the side. It looked well used and sharp, bigger and scarier than Starclaw, although it didn't look as if it was magic. We'd better go then, said Podkin, peeling Pook off Krom's leg, before my time runs out. Somehow they found the tunnel that Pod had emerged from earlier and started walking back in the damp, musty darkness. Podkin led the way, glancing back and then to see Krom walking with his arms outstretched, fingers tracing lightly along the earthen walls. Halfway down, Podkin started struggling with Pook, and the little rabbit began to whimper with hunger. Give him here, said Krom, and he hoisted him on his broad back. Pook clung there, nuzzled against his scarred fur, and gradually nodded off to sleep. Podkin thought it was worth the 5 coppers not to have to carry the little rabbit any more. They'd only gone a bit further when Krom suddenly stopped and looked behind them, his hand on his sword hilt. What is it? Podkin asked. Someone's coming up the tunnel, Krom whispered. Podkin squinted back down towards the market. He could just about make out the silhouette of something hopping and scuttling back there. It grew closer as he watched, until he could see it was the dwarf rabbit, his fellow captive, scurrying after them as fast as he could. Podkin, she managed to grasp when she reached him. What's going on? Who are you taking back to the burrow? Podkin, corrected Pod, and this is Krom. He's a soldier. I've hired to give Shape and Quince a good kicking. To fight sharp, said Mish. But your sellsword is... he can't... It doesn't matter that he can't see, Podkin interrupted. He's still going to beat them, aren't you, Krom? There was a grunt from the darkness behind and above him. Podkin thought it sounded confident, although it didn't really matter. He thought of a way to give Krom an edge, quite literally. Are you sure about this, Mish said? If it goes wrong, there's no telling what Shape and Quince will do to my brother. It won't go wrong, Podkin said. I promise, and we'll make sure our siblings are freed. If you can do that, said Mish, I'll be in your debt forever. For the rest of the walk to the burrow, Podkin silently prayed to the goddess that his plan would work. For the second time today, he was about to gamble everything on a hunch. Either the goddess herself was guiding him, or the stress of the past few days had driven him round the twist. He hoped it was the first option. The tunnel grew darker and damper. Just as the stink of mildew and mushrooms became almost overpowering, they arrived at the blanket-covered entrance. The 3 of them, 4 if you included Pook, stood silently outside for a few moments listening. Someone was snoring, and there was a crackle of a small fire. Every now and then there was a rustle of movement, and once or twice Podkin thought he heard a soft, sad sigh that might belong to Paz. Just as Krom was reaching out to push through the blanket, Podkin stopped him, his little hand tiny against the big warrior's arm. Wait, he whispered, as quietly as he could. I want you to use this. Struggling with his cloak, Podkin managed to uncover the hilt of Starclaw and pull it out of its scabbard. He felt the familiar warm tingle of the metal, and he was suddenly reluctant to let a strange person touch it. It was his only. What if this big rabbit never gave it back? It's all right, Podkin. You can trust him. It was almost as if his father was there, whispering in his ear, telling him what to do. Podkin swallowed hard and gave up the blade, knowing it was for the best. He pressed it into Krom's calloused hand. The sellsword weighed it, twisted it, and ran his fingers over the hilt. In his grip, it looked too small and puny to do any damage. He knelt to whisper back to Podkin. I have my own sword, boy. This is a little dagger. Yes, said Podkin, replied. but I want you to use that one. It's very special. And besides, I'm still your boss, aren't I? At least until the end of the afternoon. Krom shrugged. He scooped Pook off his back and handed him to Podkin, then swept aside the blanket and stepped through. There was a grunt of surprise from the burrow beyond. Podkin and Mish dashed through in time to see Quint standing in the centre room, his mouth hanging open. The scrawny rabbit was clutching his prodding stick. He looked as though he was about to give Paz a jab or two through the bars of her cage. Hearn's bristly breeches, he cursed. What's going? He never got to finish his sentence, as Krom stood right up and cracked him between the ears with Starclaw's hilt. There was a hollow clonking sound, and Quinks folded up into a senseless heap on the floor. Podkin! Paz jumped up and grabbed the bars of her cage. Pod had time to flash her a grin, and then there was a roaring from the far side of the burrow. Shape had been sleeping there, clutching a half-drunk bottle of mead. Now he was up, staring at Krom and roaring at the top of his voice. You're the blind rabbit. Nobody wants to hire. What in Hearn's name are you doing here, and why did you knock out my partner? I'm acting on behalf of my client, said Krom, and if you know what's good for you, you'll let all these little rabbits grow. Your client? Shape gave Podkin an astonished look. For a moment, Pod thought he might give in, but instead he reached for his giant club and flexed his shoulders. I'm going to kill you, blind rabbit. Then I'm going to take your client, turn him inside out, and wear him as a hat. Podkin gulped. In his head, on the way here, Krom had seemed so huge and strong. Now standing a few paces away from the hulking Mr. Shape, he didn't look half as impressive. What have you done, Pod? Paz hissed from her cage. He cringed. I think I'm just going to be turned into some very unpleasant headgear. Shape charged them, roaring as he came, his spiked club. Beatrice whistled through the air toward Krom's head. Krom just stood there, motionless. Podkin had a vision of the club knocking off his block, as if he was a particularly realistic snow rabbit. But at the last minute he stepped to one side and raised Starclaw to parry the blow. Of course, as the club was made of wood, the magic dagger sliced through it like a giant cucumber. The severed part of the club flew off and embedded itself on the top of Paz's cage. Suddenly, off balance, Shape stumbled, a look of pure surprise on his face. He managed to keep himself upright, staring at the severed piece of club in his hands. His paws gave Krom the chance to twist himself around in a spinning movement, bring one of his powerful legs up at the same time to kick Shape in the chest. The huge rabbit went flying backwards, crashing into the earthen wall of the burrow, smashing a hole right through and bringing half the ceiling cascading down to bury him. In less than a few seconds, the fight was over. There was a stunned silence, and then Podkin, Mish, Paz, and even the cage mash started cheering and whooping. Podkin took Starclaw back from Krom and used it to cut open both the cages. Paz rushed out and hugged him hard, tears in her eyes, and then Mash hugged him as well. There was so much hugging going on, Podkin almost turned to hug Krom, but the grey rabbit was standing so silently and solemnly that he thought better of it. I can't believe it! I can't believe it! Mash shouted. We're free! We're free! As I promised, I am forever in your debt, said Mish to Podkin, bowing so low her little ears brushed the floor. Mash did the same, and Pod noticed they were almost identical, the only difference being the delicate black tips at the end of Mish's ears. It wasn't me, Podkin. I mean, I didn't do anything. It was all Krom. Mish and Mash bowed at the warrior rabbit as well. He appeared not to notice. Instead, he knelt to speak to Podkin. The dagger, he said. It wouldn't happen to be magic, would it? Magic? Podkin stammered for a moment, realising he might have made a mistake in revealing the sacred weapon to someone 5 times the size of him, who was able to knock out 2 violent criminals in the time it took to peel a carrot. Whatever do you mean? Your dagger cut through that club like it was made of air. I've only seen one weapon that could do that, and it was one of the sacred 12. Krom reached out a hand and gripped Podkin by the shoulder. Not a firm grip yet, but one which could squish him like a grape should it be required. Tell me how you came by it, boy. Tell me the truth. Podkin looked in those blank eyes, wondering what kind of story he would come up and what would explain Starclaw. In the end, he realised there was no story. He had had enough of gambling and bluffing for one day. Anyway, he would tell the truth, and if he ended up getting kicked through a wall too, so be it. It's my father's, he said in a quiet voice. He was chieftain of Mumbury Warren, to the west of here. And you're right, it is magic. It can cut anything in the world except iron. Your father then, is he dead? Podkin felt top tears run from his eyes into his furs. The Gorm killed him. At least we think so. Now it's my dagger and they're trying to kill me too. The room was silent for a moment. Podkin stared at Krom, wondering what was going on in his head. Was he planning to kill them himself and take Starclaw, or turn them over to the Gorm and collect a fat reward? He was a mercenary after all. Finally, Krom spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, not gruff and harsh like it had been before. I knew your father, Podkin. I knew him well. We fought together many times, right up until he became chieftain of his warren. He was a good rabbit and a good friend. He was. Yes. And he would not have wanted to see his children lost in a place like this, running for their lives. Still kneeling, Krom drew his own sword. Podkin wondered what the blind warrior was going to do with it. There was nothing left to fight, surely. But Krom simply turned it over, holding the hilt out to Podkin and bowing his head. I offer you my service, Podkin, son of Lopkin. My life and my sword are yours to command. Not sure what to do, Podkin touched the sword lightly and muttered a thank you. Krom nodded and sheathed his weapon. He looked fierce, but a little friendlier somehow. Podkin gave him a smile, even though he knew he couldn't see it. Does that mean I get a refund? Krom surprised them all by throwing back his head and laughing. It means I don't have to sell my skills anymore. Thank the goddess. This is all very nice, said Mish, still holding his sister in a tight hug. But can we leave now? We want to get away, as far away from this stinking place as we come and never come back. That makes 6 of us, said Paz. I don't know what Bridget was doing, sending us here. I thought she was wise and clever. Podkin looked up at the serious, deadly face of Krom. Maybe she still is, sis, he said. Maybe there's a reason behind everything that's happened today. From the ruined corner of the room, Shake gave a groan and his fat belly jiggled, sending more chunks of earth tumbling down on his head. The rabbits looked at each other and nodded. Time to be somewhere else. They were just heading out of the door when the booming sound of the horn blast echoed down the tunnel. It was followed by another, then another. What's that? Podkin asked. The bone root alarm, Krom replied. Someone has forced their way past the entrance. Who could it be? Podkin thought. He knew the answer even though the words left his mouth. But the terrified look on everyone's faces, they all did right now. We have to get out of here, said Paz. Now. Okay, we're getting very close to the end. Chapter 12, The Burning, comes next. I'll see you soon.